Hello. Sorry for the delay. Great to see you. Checking things out here. Wonderful. We are back for Bach on the Road, tour stop 3. We're looking today at the G minor fugue. As always, I'll be with you with the conversation on Facebook, and it appears, to the untrained eye at least, that I may finally have gotten YouTube working as well, but I know I've said that twice before. Great to see you. Thanks for letting me know who you are and where you're joining from. I saved the fugue till last, of course. It's the biggest project. None of the movements in this G minor sonata are super long. The whole thing, especially if you don't take all the repeats, the whole piece you could play in 20 minutes, perhaps even less, and depending on your tempos. So this fugue, no more than 5 minutes, but it's a real project, and it was the first of the fugues that I learned. I think that's true for most people who study the Bachs. Excuse me for that. Partly because it's the shortest, it has maybe the simplest subject, but it's far from a simple movement. Luckily, all the things that you work on and learn and master when you're working on the G minor fugue can translate to the others, even though they're longer, particularly the C major fugue. It's the longest movement in all of the Bachs except for the chaconne, clocking in at 10 minutes or over. So this G minor fugue is a wonderful piece on its own. I almost, half the time I want to use it like an encore in a recital, but it's usually I'm pretty tired by that point, and I don't want to be super fatigued when I'm playing this. But it would be a great standalone piece, compact, and a great taste of what's to come in the other fugues. One of the things, I should mention where we are. We find ourselves in Budapest today, or at least that's what it's called now. All of these places that I'm choosing for the Bach tour stops, by the way, are structures that would have existed when Bach was around, had he traveled to these places. So I'm picking churches since he spent so much of his life in churches. In some other tour locales, they might not be called churches, but they'd be some kind of places of worship, just to keep things interesting. We're going to get to memorization in this session, just as we have in some others. And I got a very interesting email, part of which I wanted to share with you, and this is from John Goodstadt. So thank you for the email, John, and basically just posing the question to me, did you really mean what you said about memorization? Because I had spoken just very briefly and basically talked about how you needed to test the memory, play sections, and I said you could probably do a lot worse than just playing a lot of repetitions. And that's not all that I do. It depends on kind of what I need. If you can understand it melodically, harmonically, structurally, and you've got that physical memory going, perhaps the visual memory of the page, you're probably going to be in good shape memory-wise. But that's not always enough, and John sent me a whole wealth of information on more advanced steps that you can take, particularly the concepts of bringing things back out of memory, and making the point that if you just, how you cram for a test, usually not the best, probably the worst strategy for long-term memory, right? Because you're repeating information a whole lot over a very short period of time. Instead, what you'd want to do is spread the information out over intervals and force yourself to bring it back from memory over and over again after partway forgetting it. And in that way, you really make it stick in memory. But I did want to mention, and in fact, I can probably Anyway, if you go to Facebook, Memorize Music, it's a Facebook page, it's an app, really cool stuff. So thank you for pointing that out. Amazing. So many people here from so many different places. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much. Let's get to some playing, and I will perform the whole fugue, I believe, but more toward the end. Let's get at least a taste of it. Here's the fugue subject. That's it. Every fugue has a subject, right, that gets repeated and manipulated through the whole movement. And there's also a counter subject. In this case, it's just these. It's even simpler than the fugue subject. And the nice thing is, the simpler the subject, the more you can do with it, right? If you've got a really complicated subject, you're kind of boxed in because you can't manipulate it in so many ways. And this fugue has 3 entrances right in the beginning. First voice, now the second voice. Third voice. And just a little bit of transition. And that's basically how this is put together. And then there will be different episodes that will connect these more dense parts together. It's like starting here. And now we're back to the fugue subject. So, what are our main tasks, if we want to put it that way, in a fugue? The first one is to make sure that when the subject is around, when the subject is present, that people can hear it. Now, it's up to you, and you know, this comes after some technical mastery, I suppose, but it's up to you how easy, how clear you want to make it for people. Do you want them always to be able to hear the subject with no effort, really pop it out there? Or do you maybe want them to have to search for it a little bit? Because that can be fun for the listener. Once you've demonstrated that you're not going to, you know, that you can treat it a little bit like a game, it's not super serious life and death, every single chord, are you going to be able to play it or play it in tune? Once you've demonstrated that, then people can kind of relax and get into the spirit and look for that subject in whatever voice it may be. So let me play perhaps just a page or not quite, and then I'll get to some questions and some comments. Good, that takes us to D at least. And things get a little squirrely in there. We'll see if maybe the second time around, able to center that a bit more pitch-wise. And let's see what questions or comments we might have. Whoa, so many friends. Thanks. Thanks for being here. It was great to see you. Actually, I don't see any questions yet, which is just fine. They may come up as if I play something questionable, then you'll have a question. Good. Let's talk about, in the first movement, we had to talk a lot about rolling chords. Talked about the standard sort of 2 and 2 breaking of the chords, and how, even though in the beginning that might sound like all the chords are going to end up sounding the same, very cut and dried 2 and 2, how you can actually get quite a bit of variety there so that the listener doesn't really hear. There are not a ton of 4-note chords in this movement. There are some. They tend to be at the biggest moments, the moments of the most drama, most tension, and it's written that way on purpose, right? You almost have to play louder to play more notes. 3 and 4-note chords are just going to be more powerful, and so it's okay to bring those out. You can choose whether you want to sustain them more, accent them a little, but the simple fact that you're playing 3 or 4 strings is already going to raise the sonority. I mentioned that to say that mostly in this we're going to be dealing with 2 and 3-note chords or double stops. So we won't have to choose a whole lot of different speeds, but still the basic bread and butter is going to be 2 and 2. Or even if you have just 3 notes, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. So D and A and E. So you get to choose how fast you want to roll those. Do you want to make them sound almost simultaneous? Because you actually could play 3 notes really at once, and I am going to make use of that in some parts of this movement. To do that, you want to just put the bow on the middle string. In this case, it's the A string. And simply by drawing with quite a bit of weight, a little bit out away from the bridge, perhaps a little closer to the fingerboard, and an even bow speed, I can get 3 strings at once. The thing is, I can't just grab the note with a bunch of pressure and then let it go, because then I'm left with just the middle string. I also can't just draw the bow as hard as I can. I'm going to crunch it. There has to be that middle amount of weight and an even speed. So here that would sound like... It's kind of cool. It sounds a little bit like those recordings where someone has multi-tracked him or herself. People do have done that with the chaconne a lot to make it so that you can actually play the note values as they're written in the manuscript. You can hold a whole note for, or even 3 notes. You could hold 3 notes for the, or 4 notes, these long, but it doesn't quite sound right because it's not actually doable on the violin. So again, that sound of 3 strings at once. To me, that's a little bit sterile for this place. I prefer a little bit of a roll. It highlights the melody, or the subject in this case, just a little bit because I hang on to that top note, the subject note, a little bit longer, and that's part of the reason I prefer it too. I should mention that your choice of tempo also helps determine how much variation you get in the speed of the roll. If you're playing this quite a bit slower, you could choose to roll it slower then, right? Because you've got more time. At a fast clip, you really don't have time to do that, so it's going to sound almost simultaneous no matter what you do. I mean, for me, that's too fast. I almost can't navigate everything. Good. And here's a question from Rachel about measures 38 to 41. And this time I brought the music so that I can... Good. And we will for sure get to that. That's the part where Bach just writes these big chords in the music, in the manuscript, with a little sign to arpeggiate them. And you get to do whatever you want there. And we will certainly get to that, Rachel. That's a great section to discuss. So we've got the concept of rolling or not rolling. I'll mention later in the movement when I want to sound a little bit more like an organ and to play three notes at once. Now the question of which notes to hang on to. And a lot of the time that's going to be pretty subtle, and it's to draw the listener's ear toward the subject voice. So, now I also slowed down the tempo to make it more obvious. I won't really do that. But you hear that I don't just play the straight double stop the whole way. Right, I'm coming off the top note to highlight the subject line. And then it happens naturally anyway with a three-note chord because I'm rolling from bottom to top. I'm thinking, remember, as I've said in our other two sessions, I'm thinking still, though, of the bass note being on the beat. So here's how that would sound in tempo, these first three entrances of the subject. After a while, that becomes a habit. When you know what voice you're most listening to, you just start hanging on to that a little more. I should say you start letting go of the other line. And as long as that other line is still audible, especially the bass note, then you're good. And it's a nice way to draw the listener's ear to that line. Now there's a question from Juan. Does the amount of bow you use affect the tempo? Or I wonder if maybe that question also works the other way around. You know, does the tempo affect the amount of bow you use? You know, I would say that the slower you go, the more scope you have to use more bow. Slower tempo, perhaps you have a need to sustain these notes a little bit longer. And I think the amount of bow also has to do with what kind of sound you have in your ear. You know, do you hear this more airy, with perhaps even more roll? That can be a nice sound too. I was trying to exaggerate a little bit and really use a lot of bow, but you can hear there's more air to that sound, especially in the space I'm in, which is unfortunately not the nice cathedral that we see before us, but a very dead space. I'm kind of liking that openness. In a space that might have its own resonance, I might prefer a little bit more compact and trust the resonance of the space, because that would give me a little bit more core to the sound. So, you know, you can find your own way with that. But generally, the more bow you use, that implies faster bow. If we're talking same tempo, more bow implies faster bow. that's going to mean all your contact points need to move out a little bit. So that's a bit of an adjustment you would have to make. Bow pressure would be a little bit more, actually. You'd have to move out a little bit more weight. And if you need a refresher on why that is the way it is, I've got, those are the three bow variables, right? Bow speed, bow pressure, bow contact point. And I have a great free guide you can go check out. Just Google Nate's violin, 3 variables, you'll see it. That is just a refresher on how those variables interact. Now, speaking of bar 20, good, and this, nice, you're thinking on the same lines as me. In bar 20, here's an opportunity in this little section to roll in reverse. And there are many people who do that, and there are reasons why that might make sense, because the subject is on the bottom. So here's what that would sound like. Starting here. Not everybody continues to do it there, but at least that first bit. So in the first Bach on the Road section, I talked about a Joseph Silverstein masterclass where he, we were kids and he was the big teacher, so there wasn't going to be a whole lot of discussion about it, although he might have taken some questions about it. But he was very forceful about never rolling in reverse, and his reason was that it sounded odd for the bass to come in late. Now, you roll bottom to top, the melody might sound like it's going to come in late. However, there is another solution, and this is what he demonstrated in this particular masterclass to great effect. You play 3 notes at once, but hang on to the one you want to hang on to. And this technique takes some practice, it takes some doing, but really all it is, it's the same thing I showed you earlier. You're playing 3 strings at once. That means that you have your bow level on the middle string, A string. So instead of finishing on the middle string, like I naturally would, instead I'm finishing on the bottom string. And that can go for any chord in the movement. It's even a little trickier when you have 4 notes. Then if there really is a voice in the middle you need to sustain, and we'll get to that, then I think not 2 and 2, but 3 and 3. And then I could finish on D, A, or E, couldn't I? So I'd roll the bottom 3 to the top 3, and I'd finish on D. That's especially useful in the C major fugue. Get to in a later week, but there's a place where you need to bring out a bass line. And there you must make use of that technique, otherwise you're then it just sounds a little bit like I don't know, someone knocking over stacks of dominoes or something. Good. Let me take 2 more questions from here, and from Paula. Hi, Paula. Oh, you have a husband learning this on classical guitar. Any advice on that, like different phrasing? I don't have the personal experience for that, and I'm sure there are a whole sacks full of different techniques for bringing out different strings. I would imagine that you're not quite as limited. You don't have a bow direction. You've got a number of fingers, right, with which you can articulate the different strings. So I would imagine there are even more varied ways of bringing out the different strings, the different voices. Now, one thing the guitar doesn't have is the sustain, right? So it's always that articulation at the front of the note that would determine how long it stays in the listener's ear. And we've mentioned in these sessions too how originally the Baroque bows, they had far less sustain. It was much more about the front of the note as well. And really that meant the frog, because you weren't going to get much articulation up at the tip. So in that way, you know, if you're thinking of it, perhaps with the equipment with which this was originally written, it would also have been much more about the front of the note. So I don't know that there would be that much different, but since I've never really played guitar, I couldn't speak with great authority. But I love hearing these on guitar. I've heard them that way many times. And Daniel, you ask, are open strings the best way to have a beautiful connected tone? And is push and pull the most important thing to think about when practicing them? This is a great point, because a lot of times it's easy to get kind of lost in the weeds in these fugues. There are a lot of chords to learn and changes to make and voices to bring out, and can sometimes lose sight of a beautiful sound. And I'd just like to remind everyone that whatever bow strokes you use, and whether it's single notes or double stops or chords or whatever, all articulations come from that basic détaché. If I played some of the beginning just smooth and connected, no hooks, no weird stuff, no spaces, just a singing connected tone. It's a really great way to practice these. Doesn't mean you have to do that all the time, but to come back to that every once in a while so that you remember there's direction, there's phrasing. And there's that now with actual direction. Because you can always add space. That's easier to do when you're learning these fugue movements. Easier to add space later on, easier to add articulation later on than to learn it with a whole bunch of... and then try to make it sound less hacky. That's more difficult to do. Instead, if I think and just put little spaces, that goes a long way to where, I mean, that's nearly a finished product. There, I hate to say product for this great music. So yes, thinking of connecting the notes. Haven't mentioned hooking yet. In the edition that I and many other people my age learned from, the Galamian edited international edition, so many things were hooked, right? Especially the 16th notes. And that was to put chords on down bows, to put strong beats on down bows. And you can do that. There are a couple dangers, a couple things just to keep in your ear when you do decide to do that. Because I do it sometimes, but just not as much as some. Certainly not as much as is marked in the International Galamian edition here. When you do that, if I first play the subject like this, it's going to sound weird if I, right after that, right? I exaggerate there, but I've hooked it and it's a completely different articulation. I'd need to have it be the same sound. Even there's a little bit more articulation when I do the hook. So maybe then I'd want to add some for the separate. Or I could just decide, you know what, I don't mind doing some chords on up bows and I'm just not going to hook. Like a... So the ability to play these, because up bow it really works the same as down. It's still 2 and 2. Ultimately, you'll have to decide where you need the convenience of the chords on the down bow and where hooking it is going to take the listener out of the sound. I think there are a number of different note lengths or articulations you can do with the subject. The key is to keep it mostly internally consistent. There was a place where two voices alternate. It's in bar 18. I choose to do one voice longer, the other one shorter. Hopefully not too exaggerated, not too gimmicky. Something like that. That was even a bit exaggerated, maybe. So mostly I keep the length of the eighths consistent through the movement, but I may differentiate in a place like that. Good. Michael, you ask, have I ever thought about performing all six in a recital? I have. The occasion hasn't presented itself yet. Maybe I should just create that occasion. It's a lot of playing. I remember once seeing a flyer advertising, so Christian Tetzlaff, I know, has done that, all six in one go. But the flyer left out one important piece of information, so it just said, tonight, whatever time, whatever hall, Christian Tetzlaff, the complete works for solo violin. And we were looking at that laughing like, oh, all right, there's going to be a 40-hour recital here. Forgot to say Bach. So maybe someday that would be quite a mountain to climb. Henry, you ask about the phrasing, a little crescendo into the fourth note. Or does that come more naturally and you don't have to try to exaggerate it? I think it depends on you and kind of how you're starting. Some people, it's impossible for them to play anything without shaping it, And then if you're in that camp and you find yourself really kind of making it sound seasick because it's going up and down, then you might have to just make it more subtle. Most people, however, don't shape enough, especially once the chords and the double stops get going. And it's much more common to hear performances of those, and every down bow is the same. And that's especially when non-violinists hate hearing these fugues because they just sound difficult, they sound boring. As a violinist, I think, how could this ever be boring to you? There's so much going on. But for them, if you play it just with a bunch of beats and chords, then that's how it can. So I think it depends on where you're starting. I usually have to remind myself to shape. Luis, you mentioned practicing this on the piano to get a better knowledge of the harmony and the connection between the chord changes, the progressions. Excellent advice. One of the best things you can do. Something that I don't do enough because I'm such a weak pianist. When I have done it, you're absolutely right. It's because then you can't ignore any notes. On the violin, it's so easy to just focus on the melody, kind of throw the bass notes away. When you're playing on the keyboard, you can't do that. There they are, right under your fingers. You hear the sonority. It just sounds weird if you balance everything toward the top on the keyboard, and it should sound weird to you on the violin too. So that is excellent advice. Good. Let me play the next section so we can talk about some strategies for that, because we're getting to that part that is written in the manuscript just as chords. Leaves it to you to decide how you want to do it. We found ourselves in the middle of bar 24. is just written as chords. So on top is a half note, and then on the bottom is eighth notes. And then a half note in the middle. On the bottom line. And then finally, a pedal note on the bottom, just a D that you hold basically for 4 bars or so, and with on the top. So any edited edition of this will have perhaps its own suggestions for what to do. Here's something that I like to do. So that's one solution. There are all kinds of variations that one can do, and there are longer sections like this, of course, in the chaconne, in the D minor partita. And since you have more room, more time there, you can explore even further the different variations. Just where this started, I was playing 4 to a bow. You could do 2 to a bow. Some people don't start the arpeggiating right away. They might play. By this bar, by bar, what is that, 38, most people kind of do the, because it's so great to keep the resonance of the pedal tone, the D, the open D, going. But you could, let's see. That sounds kind of cheesy, but it's just to say there's nothing written there. So by far the most common is what I just did. The point in when you make your choice is that it should get more and more intense as you go. You never want there to be a point where you do a variation that takes you back in resonance. And then you arrive, of course you're going to arrive strong, and then you've got a 9-10 bar episode of 16th notes. You're undoubtedly coming into it strong, and it's going to end strong too. Before I play the episode itself, we're starting it in D minor, and we're going to end up finally in. We're going eventually to C minor. And it's a section with a lot of chords, which is to say it's another strong section. So coming into it strong, finishing strong. Therefore, in this episode, in these 9-10 bars, I want to do what I can to relax the tension somewhat, relax the sound, not only for myself physically, but for the listener. Otherwise, listener's ear is going to get fatigued. So I'm arriving. Have that series going down. And so from here, now I can build up. And here's another one of those places where 3-note chords, I want to finish on the bottom note. this is a great moment. We'll get to it in a second. This is a big change, kind of the midpoint of the whole deal. So let's see what you've got. Jefferson, you asked, for intonation practice, would you recommend tuning with a drone and checking with the lower string? How would you break down intonation repetition in a difficult passage? Well, in a movement like this, by far, I mean, there is a melody, there's a fugue subject, and that has to sound good. But by far, what's going to stick in the listener's ear, and surely your ear as you play it, is that vertical intonation, chords needing to sound in tune with themselves. Now, it's likely that if you're able to play every chord in tune with itself, that it's also in the right place horizontally. I mean, for example, it would be possible to play chords in tune with themselves. Like each of those chords has the right, I mean, that sounds ridiculous. All I mean is that you probably don't have to worry about all this at once. If you get a chord ringing nicely with itself, probably that's because your fingers are just on the right notes anyway. So maybe that sounds like a circular, like circular logic, but you could do it with a drone. The thing is, the harmony changes pretty quickly in this music. So, you know, whatever drone note works for a couple of beats is probably not going to work soon after. We have open strings, which are really useful to check against. If you're having trouble keeping a certain sonority in your head, or you're worried that you may have drifted, that happens to, you know, I'm going to play this whole movement in a minute, and it very well may happen to me in certain spots. Over time, you can develop more and more sensitivity with your ear to know when you're drifting just a bit. But pitch is one of the biggest challenges in this music. A lot of perfect fifths, perfect fourths. And when you're trying to bring out different voices too, that's a challenge. Some of the similar tactics that I would use to memorize this music, to start with small sections, polish those, you know, get 1 or 2 bars really nicely in tune, not just the beginning. It's easy to pick this up every day and start always at the beginning, but to start some other place, work 2 bars, figure out what the changes are that might throw you off, get those polished, and then expand out from there. That's what I would do. And Angeli, you ask about etudes, recommend. Yeah, for sure. Don't number 1. The only reason that I can play these fugues, well, it's up to you to say successfully or not, but the only reason I can navigate these chords is because I did a lot of work with the first don't etude, which is all 3 and 4 note chords. And in some ways that's more difficult than this, right? Because it never stops being chords. You can practice them all down. You can have a little vibrato like you would use in, well, like I would use in Bach, or you can just focus on the purity of the notes. You can do them all, you can do them down up. You can hold them for the whole bow. You can do them all up, and that's really valuable for these fugues. When you can do that, then you know you have the confidence to play any of these chords. This is not an etude, but practicing scales in double stops. You got to be doing that if you want to have any success in these. And the only reason I could play this music is because I had started finally practicing some scales in double stops, at least thirds and sixths and octaves. And that's so important to get a routine going for that if you want to have comfort in this music. Let me go on. and see if there are any super important details before we play the whole thing. Right, we had just gotten to a magical moment. C minor, but then the change. So every other time is so. And now this is the single happiest and grandest section of all. So this is worth not just rushing through. I can't sustain 4 notes at once, so I just use the whole bow and let it ring. That doesn't ring very well. Here is the one place I sustain all, sorry, the first of 2 places where I'd sustain all of them. I love the major tonality of the section, and here I really think of an organ, as Bach very easily may have had in mind. Then we've got a big episode. Again, I want to lessen the tension when I can, because after this episode, from the end of the episode to the end of the movement, is fairly unrelenting excitement. So and you'll hear it when I play the whole movement, but get to a pedal tone finally. Now these arpeggios are written out like this. If I can avoid my finger touching the open D and cutting off the ring, I'd love to. That sometimes means I've got to get my fingers more upright, put my hand in bring my arm around, but I'd love for that open D not to be disturbed. Etc. Big moment, and finally the climax of the whole thing, the middle of bar 82. Here as well, I'm going to play 3 notes at once. The subject is on the bottom. With 4 notes, there's going to be a moment when I let go of the subject note. I just live with that. I just don't want to. I don't want to be doing that. So. And finally, one more episode, and this one I really just let it go to the end. I speed up. And that, if you can't bring an organ to mind there, then you haven't heard enough of the Bach organ preludes and fugues. That's just a straight foot on the pedal and bum 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 bum. I always wish I played the organ for that. Let me see what questions you have before I play this whole thing. And Robert, you asked, when the melody is in the bottom line, how do you bring it out without getting a bad quality of sound on the top? And that may have been a prescient, or that may have been an appropriate question based on some of those chords I played. I think I was a little too ambitious in getting to the top too quickly. I think the answer is let the bottom sound, let the top come in a little bit later. It's fine, but let that bottom note sound so that your listeners can hear it. It's not really, I mean, the first people to look at this must have thought, this isn't even real music. You can't play this on the violin, and no wonder. And Michael, you asked which solo Bach was my Bach for orchestra auditions. And it, in general, it is this sonata, because it's the first one I learned. I took a Boston audition once where they required the slow movement of the A minor sonata. So they wanted everyone to play that. It's a great selection, amazing movement. We'll get to that, of course. I probably wouldn't choose something like the first movement of this sonata just because there are so many different ways in which people can play it, so many different styles of vibrato. You're bound to make someone mad. Fewer orchestras are requiring Bach in auditions now, I see, where if they are, they're requiring something more like that movement I just played for the Boston audition. And Daniel, you ask if the majority of tips and tricks work for violists as well. Absolutely, yeah. On viola, you have to be even more cognizant of being able to grab the string. Those strings are thicker. Generally, you need, obviously, slightly more weight. You have to be more aware of the front of the note to make sure it speaks clearly, but, these are minor differences. Paula, you say your don't always sounded like don't. Great. Well, why not play it all? I do have some music here today, just to give myself the best chance of not stopping. But good. All right, so the G minor fugue. All right. Yeah, love that movement. Maybe the piece should just end there. Well, no, of course, then the Siciliana is even that much more beautiful and much more of a rest. And the presto that we talked about in our first two sessions this week. It'll be interesting to go now to the other pieces. Just a little roadmap for future stops. We've got the B minor partita. Excuse me. B minor partita. Since it alternates sonatas partitas, the A minor sonata, D minor partita with the massive chaconne at the end, C major sonata with 4 very difficult movements, including a fugue twice as long as this one, and finally the E major partita with its first movement, Preludio, that I think may have been the single Bach movement that I learned the first. An amazing way to wrap up the set. But yeah, means so much for me to be able to share some time with you guys on Bach, especially these days, as you know. So can't thank you enough for being here, and great questions as well. Great questions and comments. You help me think and rethink about how I approach this music, and yeah, maybe it'll someday will be the complete set, the complete works for solo violin. I'll make sure and put Bach on the flyer, and if I do that, I will remember these days as well. So let's come back next week if you're able. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we'll look at the B minor and be in a different tour stop. So thanks so much for being here. I'll see you soon. See you next week.